The little girl ran straight up to our table, stopped in front of my husband, and said something that made my entire world freeze. "Daddy, you promised you'd come today." For a moment, nobody moved. My husband's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. The sound of laughter and chatter inside the ice cream shop suddenly felt distant, like someone had turned down the volume on the entire room. Because the girl standing in front of us couldn't have been older than 7. And I had never seen her before in my life. My name is Rachel Donovan. I'm 35 years old, and until that afternoon I believed my marriage was normal. Not perfect, but stable. My husband, Eric, and I had been married for 11 years. We lived in a quiet suburb outside Portland, Oregon, in the kind of neighborhood where kids still ride their bikes in the street and neighbors wave from their driveways. We had a comfortable house, a predictable routine, and one son, Mason, who was 8 years old and obsessed with dinosaurs. For more than a decade, I believed I knew everything important about the man I married. His childhood, his parents, his favorite food. The story about the time he got fired from a pizza place when he was 19. I thought I knew the shape of his life. Looking back now, that belief seems almost embarrassingly naive. But when you spend more than a decade with someone, your brain builds a quiet assumption that there are no entire chapters missing from their story. The day everything changed was a completely ordinary Saturday. The kind of day that doesn't look like the beginning of a disaster. Eric had suggested we stop at a small ice cream shop near the park after Mason's baseball practice. The place was bright and cheerful, painted in pastel colors with a chalkboard menu listing ridiculous flavors like lavender honey and caramel sea salt. Families filled most of the tables. Children ran around with sticky fingers and melting cones. The air smelled like sugar and waffle cones. It was the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever happens. Eric ordered a double scoop of chocolate. I got vanilla with strawberries. We sat at a small round table near the window. Sunlight spilled across the floor in soft rectangles. Outside, people walked their dogs past the park. Everything felt normal. Comfortably normal. Then the little girl appeared. She walked across the shop floor quickly, weaving between tables like she already knew exactly where she was going. Her brown hair was tied into 2 uneven ponytails. She wore a yellow dress with tiny white flowers, and her eyes were locked directly on Eric. She stopped in front of him, close enough that her knees touched the edge of our table. Then she said it again. "Daddy, you said you'd be here today." Eric froze. Not confused. Not surprised. Frozen. The difference between those reactions is small, but unmistakable. Confusion looks like someone searching for an explanation. What I saw in Eric's face looked like panic. "I think you've got the wrong person," he said carefully. The girl frowned. "No, I don't." She tilted her head slightly, exactly the way Mason did when something didn't make sense. "You're my dad." Something inside my chest tightened, because children are terrible liars, especially young ones. And the certainty in her voice sounded like recognition, not imagination. Before the moment could stretch any longer, a woman rushed across the shop. She looked flustered, embarrassed. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, placing her hands on the girl's shoulders. She sometimes mixes people up. Her voice sounded practiced. Too practiced. She pulled the girl gently toward the door. The girl resisted slightly, looking back over her shoulder at Eric. Her expression had changed. No longer confused. Just hurt. And that was the moment something inside me shifted. Because Eric wasn't laughing about the misunderstanding. He wasn't shaking his head. He wasn't saying anything. He was staring at the table like someone who had just watched a bomb nearly explode. We finished our ice cream in silence. Eric barely touched his. When we walked back to the car, the tension between us felt thick and strange. Once we were inside the car, I asked the obvious question. "Do you know that girl?" Eric shook his head immediately. "No." Too quickly. "What about the woman?" "Never seen her before." He started the engine. His hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "Kids say weird things sometimes," he added. But his voice sounded different. Flat. Controlled. Normally I would have accepted that explanation. But one detail kept replaying in my mind. When the girl said "Daddy," Eric hadn't looked confused. He had looked terrified. That night, the image of the girl in the yellow dress kept returning. Her voice. Her certainty. The way she looked at Eric before leaving. Around midnight, I got up to get a glass of water. Eric had fallen asleep on the couch while watching television. His phone lay on the coffee table beside him, unlocked. For several seconds, I just stared at it. In 11 years of marriage, I had never checked Eric's phone. Trust had always felt easier than suspicion. But something about the ice cream shop had cracked open a question I couldn't close again. I picked up the phone and opened his messages. At first, everything looked normal. Work conversations, group chats, family messages. Then I noticed a contact saved as Mike Electric. The most recent message read, "She keeps asking when you're coming back." My stomach dropped. I opened the conversation and began scrolling. The messages went back nearly 3 years. Photos, schedules, carefully arranged visits, mentions of school events, doctor appointments, birthday parties, and scattered through the messages were photos of the little girl. The same girl from the ice cream shop, standing next to Eric, smiling, holding balloons, blowing out candles. My hands started shaking so badly I had to sit down, because the girl calling my husband Dad wasn't confused. She wasn't mistaken. She wasn't lying. She was telling the truth. But the worst discovery appeared further up the conversation. A message from a woman named Lena, the woman from the ice cream shop. The message read, "She deserves to know you're her father eventually." I felt the room tilt slightly, because suddenly the math became impossible to ignore. The girl looked about 7 years old, maybe 8, which meant she had been born 4 years before Eric and I got married. I sat in the dark living room for nearly an hour, staring at the phone in my hands, trying to understand how an entire human being could exist for 7 years without me knowing. When I finally looked up, Eric was still asleep on the couch, breathing slowly, peacefully, like a man whose secrets were still safe. But they weren't safe anymore. And for the first time since the ice cream shop, I realized something terrifying. The little girl hadn't just called my husband Dad. She had called him that in front of me, as if she didn't even know I existed, which meant someone had been living a life where I wasn't part of the story at all. And the next morning, I decided I was going to find out exactly what that life looked like. The next morning felt strangely quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet you get on a Sunday morning when the house is still asleep. This was the kind of quiet that happens when something inside your life has shifted, but no one else knows it yet. Eric was standing in the kitchen making coffee, the same way he had every morning for years. Same blue mug, same routine, same small sigh when he took the first sip. If someone had walked into the house at that moment, they would have seen a completely normal family. But inside my head, nothing felt normal anymore, because now I knew something I couldn't unknow. Somewhere out there, a 7-year-old girl believed my husband was her father, and judging by the messages on his phone, she wasn't wrong. Eric kissed me on the cheek before leaving for work. The gesture felt oddly mechanical. "See you tonight," he said. I nodded, and for the first time in 11 years, I wondered if those words meant something completely different to him than they did to me. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the empty coffee mug he had used. The house was quiet. Mason had already gone to school. The dog was sleeping by the back door. Everything looked like a normal weekday morning. Except now every ordinary detail felt like part of a stage set. Like the life I thought I had been living might actually be something Eric had carefully arranged. For a long time I didn't move. Because once you start investigating someone you love, you cross a line. And there's no way to walk back across it. But eventually curiosity wins over comfort. And by mid-morning I found myself opening Eric's messages again. This time I read them carefully. Not like someone looking for a single shocking revelation. Like someone piecing together a timeline. And the timeline was disturbingly clear. Eric and Lena had started communicating regularly about 3 years earlier. The messages were polite at first, focused almost entirely on the little girl. Her name, I discovered, was Sophie. 7 years old. Loved horses. Hated math. Apparently obsessed with strawberry ice cream. The early messages read like conversations between 2 adults trying to coordinate visits. But as the months passed, the tone shifted. The conversations became longer, more casual, more personal. Eventually, the messages stopped sounding like logistics, and started sounding like something else entirely. One message from about 2 years earlier caught my attention. Lena had written, "She keeps asking why you can't stay overnight." Eric's reply came a few minutes later. "I'll figure something out soon, I promise." I stared at the words for a long time, because they revealed something important. Eric wasn't just visiting occasionally. He was trying to manage expectations, trying to explain his limited presence, trying to maintain two different versions of himself. The more I read, the more another pattern became obvious. Eric's business trips, the ones he had been taking every few weeks for years. They almost always lined up with weekends mentioned in the messages. I opened my calendar and began checking, one by one. March, Eric in Seattle for work. Same weekend, Lena wrote, she's excited for the beach trip. June, Eric working a conference in San Diego. Same weekend, Lena wrote, thanks for staying the whole weekend. October, Eric meeting with a client out of town. Same weekend, Lena wrote, she cried when you left. My chest tightened slowly, because the pattern was undeniable. Eric hadn't been traveling for work. He had been traveling across the city for 3 years. While I packed his suitcase, while Mason asked if Dad would bring him something back from the airport, while I told myself it was normal for his job to involve travel, I closed the phone. Suddenly the kitchen felt too small, like the walls had moved closer without me noticing. For a moment I considered confronting him immediately, but another thought stopped me. If Eric had been hiding this for years, he would be prepared to deny it, prepared to explain it away, prepared to tell me exactly what I wanted to hear. And suddenly I realized something important. If I wanted the truth, I couldn't ask Eric. I had to see it myself. The next morning I did something I never imagined I would do. I followed my husband. Eric left for work at 8:30. I waited 10 minutes before getting in my car. My hands trembled slightly as I started the engine. I felt ridiculous, suspicious, like someone spying on their own life. Eric's car turned toward the highway. For several minutes, everything looked normal. The route matched the drive to his office. I almost laughed at myself. Maybe I had misread everything. Maybe there was an explanation. Then Eric took an exit he had never taken before. My heart started pounding. He drove through a residential neighborhood on the east side of town. Small houses, tree-lined streets, children's bikes leaning against driveways. The kind of place where families lived. After a few minutes he slowed down, turned onto a quiet street, and parked in front of a small white house with blue shutters. I parked half a block away, far enough that he wouldn't see my car, close enough to watch. At first nothing happened. Eric sat in his car for a minute. Then he stepped out, walked toward the front porch, and knocked. The door opened. Lena stood there. Even from a distance I recognized her immediately. The same woman from the ice cream shop. They spoke briefly. Then, Lena stepped aside. Eric walked inside the house like someone who belonged there. My chest felt hollow, but I stayed in the car, because something told me the moment wasn't over yet. About 10 minutes later, the front door opened again, and the little girl ran outside. Sophie, the same yellow dress from the ice cream shop. She ran straight into Eric's arms. He lifted her easily and spun her in a circle. Her laughter echoed down the quiet street. I had seen Eric play with Mason like that 100 times. The same smile, the same easy warmth, the same natural affection. But watching it now felt like seeing a memory that had been stolen. Because that wasn't a visiting uncle. That wasn't a family friend. That was a father. Eric carried Sophie down the porch steps and set her on the grass. She grabbed his hand and pulled him toward a small plastic playhouse in the yard. Lena stood in the doorway watching them. Her expression calm, comfortable, familiar. The three of them looked exactly like a family. I sat in the car for nearly 20 minutes watching them, trying to process what I was seeing, trying to reconcile the man playing in that yard with the man who slept in my bed every night. Eventually, Eric walked back to his car. He kissed Sophie on the forehead. Then he kissed Lena. Not quickly, not secretly, comfortably, like it was something they did all the time. When he drove away, I stayed where I was, because I needed a few minutes to breathe again. The strange thing about that moment was how calm I suddenly felt. Not happy, not relieved, just clear, because the mystery was gone. Eric wasn't torn between two lives. He had built them both. Carefully, deliberately. One life with me, and another life only 25 minutes away. For 11 years I believed I knew the man I married, but sitting there in my car, watching the quiet street return to normal, I realized something terrifying. I hadn't been sharing Eric with another woman. I had been sharing him with another entire family. And somehow, I was the last person to find out. And when he spoke, his voice sounded smaller. I thought I could manage both. The simplicity of the answer was almost unbelievable. You thought you could just keep two families forever? He shrugged weakly. I thought eventually things would settle. The statement was so absurd it almost made me laugh again. You don't accidentally build two families, Eric, I said quietly. You plan it. Eric didn't argue. After a long moment, he said something I hadn't expected. I didn't know about Sophie at first. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? When Lena got pregnant, we had already broken up, he said. She told me after we were already dating. That detail shifted something slightly. Not enough to excuse anything, but enough to understand the timeline. So you decided to hide her, I said. Eric nodded. I thought if I told you, you'd leave. And that seemed worse to you than lying for 11 years? He didn't answer. Because there was no answer that didn't sound terrible. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the one question I hadn't asked yet. Does Lena think you're leaving me? Eric looked up slowly. His expression changed. Something uneasy flickered across his face. Yes, he said quietly. The word hung in the air between us. When? He hesitated again. Soon. The realization landed slowly. Heavy. Cold. Eric hadn't just been balancing two families. He had been preparing to replace one with the other. All those weekend visits. All those promises in the messages. All those careful explanations about staying overnight. He had been slowly transitioning his life from one home to another. And the little girl in the ice cream shop had accidentally accelerated the timeline. For a moment, I simply stared at him. This man I had loved for more than a decade. This man who had shared birthdays, holidays, and quiet Sunday mornings with me. And suddenly I understood something important. The person I thought I married didn't actually exist. He was a version of Eric that only lived inside the life we built together. The real Eric was the one sitting in front of me. A man who believed secrets could be maintained forever. A man who believed families were interchangeable. A man who believed consequences could always be delayed. I stood up slowly. What happens now? Eric asked. I looked at him for a long moment and realized something surprising. I wasn't afraid anymore, because the worst part had already happened. The truth had already arrived. Tomorrow, I said calmly, you're going to tell Mason the truth. Eric's eyes widened. All of it? Yes. Children deserve honesty, even when adults don't. Then I walked toward the hallway, but before leaving the room, I paused. Oh, and Eric? He looked up. You should probably tell Sophie the truth, too. About what? That you had another family this whole time. Because secrets don't disappear just because they're inconvenient. Eventually they walk into the room. Sometimes quietly. Sometimes dramatically. And sometimes they walk across an ice cream shop in a yellow dress, look at a man, and call him Dad. And suddenly every hidden truth in the room has nowhere left to hide.